And in case your question is not answered during this session due to a paucity of time, be sure to raise it with any mentor or with the Atma team or another member of the collaborative afterwards, so that we can help you move through this with the tailored support that you need to support your organization. So with that, I will hand it back to Sneha and look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Okay, so we're about to start with the first session planned for today, which is on the COVID-19 crisis, managing through tough times. Let me introduce to you who our speakers will be for this today. Soumitra Pandey is a partner and head of the Mumbai office at Bridgespan, with around 25 years of experience in strategy and operations consulting across a wide variety of industries. At Bridgespan, Soumitra has led projects in rural livelihoods, healthcare, education, and rights of populations for marquee NGOs and philanthropic organizations in both India and the Middle East. He has also written several thought leadership pieces on scaling NPOs in India and effective philanthropy. Prior to Bridgespan, Soumitra held senior partner roles at Ernst & Young and Accenture. Soumitra is a chartered accountant and has an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Welcome, Som. Co-presenting with Soumitra is his colleague Sudarshan Sampathkumar, or Sudi. He is also a partner in the Mumbai office and has around 30 years of experience in performance improvement, strategy, and operations consulting across a wide variety of industries. At Bridgespan, Sudi is leading efforts related to impact investing and CSR, apart from engagements in healthcare and agriculture. Prior to joining Bridgespan about 7 months ago, Sudi was a senior partner in Bain & Company. Earlier, he was also a partner at Accenture. He is an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and a BE from the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Welcome, Sudi. We're really happy to have both of you here. And I'm now going to pass the mic over to you. Feel free to start your presentation.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just 1 second. I'm just trying to share my screen here.
Yes, please.
Som, can you share your screen, please? So thank you everyone for joining this call. I think Soumitra and I are delighted to be part of this gathering of so many people who are interested in this sector. I think clearly we are all facing very difficult times, and there's lots of things that are happening. So one thing I think that is common to all of us is that we are dealing with issues that are related to economic recession, potential change in the government policy, and a lot of concerns around where the funding might actually move. And again, I think it's well known that many NGOs and people in the social sector take much longer to recover in terms of coming back to normal situation of operations and finances than say some of the corporate sector entities. And I think with this pandemic, I think clearly the challenges are going to be more than usual. And it's going to be very challenging even for some of the communities that all of you are serving so well. So I think it's not about just protecting the entity in terms of its operations and funding, but it's also about the employees and also handling some of the financial distress that might come out of all this. So moving ahead, what we are trying to do today is actually cover 3 topics very quickly. The first one is actually related to just looking at what might be some of the potential impact that might be happening with the NGOs. The second is to actually, which Soumitra will present, share a framework for managing through these times. A lot of it is based on some of the work that Bridgespan has done and some of the knowledge capital that's been gathered through working with so many people around the world. And the last part of our presentation today will be concerned with basically trying to answer, any questions, that might come through. So just to set the context, if we move to the next slide, just to set the context here, it's very clear to us that, this is not something that's going to get fixed overnight from an economic perspective. If one were to track the 40-year cycle of the Sensex, they kind of, pointed towards the Indian stock markets. We know that the last major crash in 2008 had to come back. And, potentially for NGOs, that period might be a little bit longer. Now, very intricately connected with the creation of wealth and general valuation in the markets is the fact that a lot of ultra high net worth individuals, CSR funding, many of the people who fund, some of the funders that go into the NGO sector, all of this is kind of impacted, by what the market depicts. And therefore, it's very, very clear that, there will be some constraints in the market. And even if the corporate sector recovers fairly soon, and even we know that it might be 18 months or thereabouts, it will take a long time to get to normal, and business as usual for everybody will take quite some time to come back. And therefore, this is something that that's going to get impact all of us, and it's certainly going to have a lot of impact on what we are going to do in the immediate as well as the medium to long term. If I actually go a little bit deeper into how some of this might work, I think broadly the first two kind of areas which will be impacted are the operations and the financial aspects of every NGO. As far as the operations go, I think there's going to be lots of impact, and I think all of you know this, but it's more important just to do a quick recap, because some of the points of view that we will be presenting shortly are related to what we believe are some of the issues that are impacting operations. Obviously, the first is that the ops team itself is going to face challenges because of lack of ability to be on the ground, which in other words means that you don't have volunteers on the ground. There's also the issue of lack, in this case of the pandemic, lack of personal protection equipment. Frontline workers who are so used to actually dealing with the community that they service are no longer going to have access to them. This is further complicated by the fact that the home life of many of these individuals may also be directly impacted, because they now have to manage their home, their children in difficult circumstances. And that also is going to add a lot of strain on the operations. And it's also true that a lot of the operations itself might undergo change. For instance, if some of the major programs are kind of slowed down to divert resources and funding to something that might help with the COVID-19, then obviously a new operating model will have to be defined, and certainly people will have to be trained and oriented towards these new operating methods. So therefore, there could be a lot of impact on the operations. And it's very clear again that, for instance, if you take Akshay Patra, they have been actually looking at the issue of migrant workers heading back home and packing things for them to be able to eat something, because many of them have been starving as they do the long walk home. So I think, clearly that would look at creating a new operating model itself. So there's lots of things that are happening on the operating side. And that is further challenged by the fact that the finances itself will pose a lot of challenge. And in a severe economic crisis, where it's impacting everybody, from the funders to the people who are actually doing the work on the ground, it is quite ironic that the people who are actually doing the work on the ground are one of the people who are impacted the most. But having said that, it's very clear that the resources are going to be in short supply. Also, given the pressure from the government, given the immediate needs of the pandemic, I think a lot of the resources may also be diverted. This means that some of the programs that have been funded may be challenged with respect to availability of funding and certainly timely funding, which leads to the issue of liquidity. So there may be short-term constraints on your liquidity, on the ability to actually have cash and fund some of the programs. And therefore, there will be choices that will have to be made with respect to which programs are going to actually continue full steam, some which may continue full steam, some which may have to be kind of curtailed a little bit but more about that, in a short while. So we can certainly see that, there are others who are actually raising additional funding just for this epidemic and this COVID-19 issue. But that also, is something that is still playing out. Certainly from the international perspective, while we speak to majority of the international funders, there is an intent to do a lot, but some of the shape of the exact funding that might come towards the country is still somewhat undetermined. And therefore, there may be some time lag before some of this actually comes to the ground. Also, the government itself is actually tackling the issue of, how to coordinate all the efforts that go through, and, how do they actually get the funding to the areas and the communities, that matter the most. So there's going to be, I think, a fair issue with respect to the funding as well. If we go to the next slide, I think it's very clear that, apart from those two issues, one of the areas that we would certainly like to highlight, something that we believe is going to be extremely important for every one of you, are the people issues. Your staff, the people who work for you. I think the new working conditions, this constant pressure of lockdown, staying at home, and a lot of unpleasant news in social media, it certainly impacts the mental health. And I know many people who have actually been shutting themselves off so as to hear less of the negativity and focus on some of the positives that might be emerging from all this, if there are any. But clearly that can impact productivity, morale, performance. And it's something that we all have to deal with, and I'm sure each one of us is dealing with it, not just the employees. And when you look at it in terms of exactly how it impacts, it impacts in terms of attention span, it impacts in terms of productivity. So there's a lot of issues, in terms of working with a team, which is no longer possible because face-to-face meetings are that much more difficult. So there's lots of issues related to working from home as well, and that requires a lot of personal adjustment. It requires a lot of technology support, and we will be covering that a little bit, because I think, not like some of us may take technology support for granted, but that's not the case with many people. In fact, I'm told that there are some the entities which are providing laptops and some technology solutions who have seen a spurt in their demand, largely because people who are never used to laptops are now using laptops, screens at home, and some software that they were not using in the past. And finally, there are bandwidth issues as well. I mean, not all of us have high intensity bandwidth, and that's probably a luxury for some of the select few in this country. And many of the others, it's going to be a lot more difficult to do. So to sum it all up, I think, there is so much uncertainty that, we have to figure out, what is our priority? How do we shift our focus if required? How do we shift to those that really matter? How do we actually take each of our programs and look at the portfolio and see how we might follow the funding, or actually make sure that we maintain the core and make sure that we maintain some of the impact that we are creating while there's so much noise around us, and also do this in a manner where we can't travel, and we do this in a manner where we have constrained funding, and also looking at the future. Some of these models, like working from home or less travel or reduction in funding, may actually become a norm as we go forward. So that to me was really like the kind of context setting to really figure out how we can actually, how we are going to be impacted in a way, and what are the kinds of issues that we might actually be wanting to respond to. Next slide, so. Soumitra, I think you have to take over from here. So,
You may be on mute.
Yeah. I had to be unmuted by the host. So thanks for doing that. I've seen, a lot of people join over the course of time, and I just wanted to kind of bring this back to the comments Mary Ellen made, and that comment, I think the one comment that has stuck with me, and which is almost a truism, is there is really no silver bullet for a couple of reasons, right? One, each of our individual, circumstances is different. Secondly, this is, an event that we are facing, which is like none other in our lives. So many of us have seen at least two or three economic downturns, the last one being in 2008. But this is more than an economic downturn, right? Because in an economic downturn, you're only facing issues of cash, which are very, very important, of course. But your access to the communities, the safety of your staff is not an issue, right? When you say when in an economic downturn you talk of saving staff, you are basically talking of not doing retrenchments or letting go of people. But here there is a huge issue to their life and safety of their health, right? So I think in that sense, this is very, very different situation, right? But what we'll do is, very quickly, kind of share a few thoughts in terms of, how NGOs have dealt with this situation, right? And the frame of all this is to understand that there's a lot happening around us, but what are those one or two things that are in our control, right? So I think this is basically focusing on things that we can control and what we can do our best. And then, of course, things may or may not still work out. But by doing some of these things, you're giving yourself a better chance to survive, and a longer runway to kind of come out of this, uh, distress and, crises that we're facing, right? So with that, there are 8 steps, and I'll just quickly go through them. As Sudarshan said, this is all available online, and you can read the detailed article, later. But I think the first thing in this situation is really to act quickly and decisively, but not reflexively, right, in a planned manner. And I think this is important because I think the crisis is upon us, right, and people hopefully have already started acting and making plans, right? So typically everyone hopefully had a plan to start with, but I think this is a situation where you need to have, I would say, a plan B, C, and D, right? And really identify in your work what are the nice to have things and start kind of cutting back on that. I think cash conservation, whether you're running a social enterprise or an NGO, is as important as it is for people who are running businesses, right? So I think conserving cash is important for 2 reasons. One, of course, it gives you, a longer runway. Two, it also is important for sending the right signals, both to your, employees and organization as a leadership, from the leadership, and also to your funders, right? So I think it's very clear requirement to have a plan B, C, and D. In fact, I was speaking to an NGO leader whom I can't name, but very much from India in the space of education, where they've actually come up with 2 scenarios where they're saying that, hey, our funding goes down by 25% and it takes 6 to 8 months to kind of get it back up to where it was. And the other more pessimistic scenario where they are looking at fundings going down by more than a third and the recovery taking 18 months. And in all those situations, what they will do, right? Also, I think they've been very clear to, I'd say that, hey, we are not going to wait for the funding to go down. So if these things play out, we know that we are in scenario 1, or if these things start playing out, it's a signal for what's going to be a scenario 2, which is a long haul, which is a much more conservative kind of scenario, right? I think that's important to, based on your own uh, areas of operation, identifying a few plans and scenarios for yourself. The other thing is really to decide when and how to dip into reserves. So now each organization will have different levels of reserves. Some may be on 1 month of reserve, some are, hopefully on 5 or 6 months of reserve. In the ideal situation, most not-for-profits should have, reserves to last them 4 to 6 months, but I know how funders are, and therefore not everyone has the luxury of doing that. But whatever reserves you have, identify what are those conditions and what are those areas where you're going to use that reserves, right? And if you need any board approvals or anything like that, have those approvals in place to kind of dig into your reserves. Uh, One thing I've just wanted to mention is I've seen some organizations have moved fast, and for example, many organizations have said, we are in April, right? And April is where raises are given by a lot of organizations. So organizations have actually stopped, raises for the time being. They've frozen it. I've also heard of organizations that are renegotiating their rent. So, for example, I know of an organization which has said like, "Hey, these are tough times. We don't want you to reduce the, rentals, but give us a 3-month moratorium," right? So, I think identifying the big costs, identifying what can be let go of, and kind of taking some actions, having scenarios is the first part, right? uh, as you do that, I'll move to point 2, which is really protecting the core. And I think this is very important, because when you cut back, and there will be a pressure, either you'll cut back on your own, or your funders will make you cut back, or just lack of cash will actually require you to cut back on your expenses, right? And as you do that, I think it's very important to understand what's core, right? And once you identify that, and again, there is no silver bullet for this, right? You have to look at your programs, you have to look at the logic frame, you have to say that, hey, these are the components of my program which are the most important, and then there are other components without which I can do with, right? And they are nice to have, we will do them later, we can put a pause button on that. So I think identifying those, and also then identifying what are the unrestricted funds and other resources that can be actually put behind these programs. So I'll share a couple of examples. One, I know an organization that's working with farmers, and the theory of change has 3 aspects. So the first leg is actually to help them in giving and providing information on inputs. The second, they are connecting them to the markets, and the third part of it is building the capacity amongst the women farmers to run what are known as FPOs or FPCs, which is farmer producer organizations or companies, which are basically nothing but a collectivization of farmers, right? And what the organization has decided is, while from a sustainability perspective, really capacity building is important, but next 6 months, they're going to go slow on that. And they had one funder which actually was funding this part of their program, and they are now talking to that funder to see, for the next 6 to 8 months, if money that the funder has committed on capacity building can be made unrestricted and moved to the other areas. So again, I mean, to cut back, but cut back not with a broad sword, but like use the surgeon's scalpel, identify your core, and I would say don't cut back on your core. As we do this, I think the other thing that's important is really identifying people who matter, right? And this could be not only from a seniority perspective, it could be from expertise, it could be people who are generally optimistic, in your field. It may not be somebody very senior, but somebody who really understands the culture of the organization, and helps drive the organization and its culture forward, right? Identifying these people, investing them in them heavily, I think is important. I think most of these people should feel like that they are allies, they are partners in kind of solving the problem along with you, rather than just being at the receiving end of your thoughts and your plans, right? Uh, an example here would be, I know of somebody who has actually built a cross functional team already, and it is across levels. This is the war room that they've developed, and what they've done is they've identified they're high performers across levels, and they have actually got them to now focus on on this crisis. And what this cross-functional team is doing is looking at the current situation in terms of how do you still run the operations, which is, people may call it crisis management, continuity planning, or whatever. They're also looking at how do they engage with the external world. So they're making a communication plan, they're doing a funding strategy refresh, and they're doing work around keeping the motivation level of the staff high. Additionally, they're also looking at, in this scenario where they are largely working from home, and this organization basically works in providing after school support to children who go to municipal schools. And since they can't now travel to their houses, really, how do they still continue the program going? So people are, funding is important, but once you have funding, what's going to help you solve the problem is the right set of people. And there are some people who are very good when things are fine, and those people are required. There are some people who are good at in a crisis situation, and understanding those is very, very critical. Next is really, and I'm just going ahead. Hopefully we'll have time for questions, but if I'm fast, just do stop me. The next is really, stay very, very close to your key funders. I mean, this goes without saying, uh, but I think few things to kind of consider, right? I mean, if you are, forget this crisis in your life, if you are in any difficulty, who do you go to? You go to individuals who know you well and who trust you, right? And whom you trust. So identify those funders who've been along with you for a very long time, and they are the most likely actually to help you in this downturn. Getting new funding in this downturn is going to be very, very, very difficult. It's been proven time over again. So I think, identify the core funders, focus on them, pick up the phone, talk to them, share the challenges that you are having, share the plan A, B, C, or scenarios that you're building out, get their inputs, get them on board. Equally ask them, because they may themselves, so for example, if it's a CSR organization, right, uh, a month or 2 months of their revenue may actually be lost, right? And they, so check with them, like, how do they feel about their cash flows, and create this atmosphere of transparency. I think transparency and trust. Transparency leads to trust, and I think creating and maintaining that, in this scenario is important. You could actually also ask them for reference, because what we are seeing is a lot of organizations, sometimes when such crises happen, it also opens other people who are not giving big to actually start giving, and many of them don't know where to give. uh, and if your funders are connected to these people, they could really give referrals, right? So I think that is very, very important to my mind. That's the probably one place where you might actually get some additional or new funders. Rework as much funding as possible, of course, to high priority activities, and also kind of renegotiate, if possible, restricted funds. So for example, in the US, I don't know if it's not US, it's a global thing. So everyone who had signed the giving pledge has now said that for this year, all the funding is completely unrestricted. And the reason it's important is then it kind of helps you, focus your funding on what we had called the core programs, right? And I'd given you an example of how somebody was trying to change a restricted funding to, an unrestricted funding. The fifth element I would say is, and I'm moving to the next slide, just give me a second, is to focus on really what we've called shaping up the organization, right? So any organization, whether it is running for profit or not for profit, uh, over time has inefficiencies, right? And it's in these times of difficulty actually, identifying those inefficiencies and kind of bringing about the change is often found to be easier because people are open to change, people are open to new ways of working. You could actually look at your decision-making process, and I've seen organizations where they would spend a lot of time in the office on certain decisions, getting everyone along, which is important, of course. But sometimes you tend to overdo it, right? And when you do this now in a virtual environment, it's becoming very, very frustrating, right? So you can very well look at the decision making process and say, hey, how it can be improved. And that needs to be done because in this kind of environment, right, decisions need to be taken fast, as as we said in the first point, right? So I think that may be one example. Looking at your processes, how they can be improved, could be another example. And while it sounds counterintuitive, not in this cycle, it's too early to say. In the last cycle, which was in 2008 of economic downturn, we've actually seen, some NGOs really get some great leaders for especially corporate functions because, people might lose jobs even in the for-profit world. So, if you're looking for HR or finance kind of, you know, resources, people have, of course, found those resources in this downturn. Now it's difficult to hire, but if it's a critical resource, you have a funder who understands and a funder who's been asking you to kind of fix your finances or your MIS for the last, 12 months, and now you found the right person to do that. It's a conversation to my mind that you can have. The other thing is, really collaborating to reduce costs and, kind of extend your impact. Right? So I would kind of look at this in two kind of buckets. So the first bucket to my mind is the backend, services. So for example, can you actually collaborate with other NGO, whether they are in your sector or not in your sector, to look at some of your backend costs? Can some of your HR resources be shared? Can some of your finance resources or such resources be shared? Can you buy jointly, stuff that can kind of help you save costs? That to my mind is easier. In the past, people have also tried, and this is where they are being in, either in the same sector or sometimes across sectors, to see if the front end cost or the field costs also could be shared in terms of people doing a little bit more. It's difficult, but not impossible, right? To do that. I would just move to the last two, and to my mind, generally, and we've done this research, and I've spoken to, both in the US and globally, and even in India about 8-9 months ago, in terms of how people are leveraging the board. And we believe that the board in India is typically under leveraged. There are few ways that you could, kind of leverage the board, right? I mean, firstly, keep them informed of all your plans, your financial health, your planning process. As I said, you should do with the funders, create that sense of transparency, get them on board for two reasons. Mostly these people will have a lot of expertise, so they can pressure test your plans. Secondly, once they are onboarded, I've seen board members help out in fundraising in these times. Board members themselves can kind of contribute. So I think, keeping the board involved, getting them, to kind of buy into your ideas, pressure test your solutions, sharing, their wisdom and sometimes wealth, is important, right? I'll just share an idea, an example here where I know somebody who is currently talking to their board members in terms of, uh, you know, basically funder management. And this organization has identified 4 or 5 key funders that are important. And normally the board would not engage directly with the funders. But in this case, they've talked to the funders, talked to the board members. and they have, some of the board members are okay, in addition to the CEO, who's of course talking to these core funders, actually, again, having a conversation with these core funders to kind of share the plans, challenges, and get them kind of, on board. The last is basically communicate openly and often. So I think, I assume most of you are leaders on this call. And this times of, crisis, as Sudarshan said, a lot of people are, everyone is mentally exhausted, right? And there's a lot of anxiety. So I think open and frequent communication from the top is important. I think while you may not have a full handle on the situation, and that's why you may have scenarios, but I think sharing with them a plan is also important, because people are looking for direction, right? I mean, just kind of having a regular conversation without a plan in mind. And you can have a plan saying that these are the 2-3 things that we are thinking of, but we really don't know which one will play out, is important. Again, I would say, share challenges openly, get their inputs, uh, you know, create a sense of transparency, praise people, right? I mean, if somebody's, even helped you save 1,000 rupees on cost, I think, praise them in, in team meetings and stuff like that, so that I think you're kind of creating this, uh, atmosphere of trust, atmosphere of everyone kind of pitching in, and, creating a team that's kind of resilient. So those were the 7-8 points. Now, honestly, these work in all situations, whether that's a pandemic or a financial crisis, or just a, economic downturn. But on the pandemic side, there are a few more points, and I'll kind of request, Sudarshan to share them.
Thank you, Som. I think specifically, I think there are two topics that become particularly important in a scenario, like what we are in today. I think the first is leadership, and the second is, the specifics of some work from home principles. I think the first is that, in terms of leadership, the whole style has to change from, not just being a leader, but also being a coach. And, that requires us to recognize a number of, issues that, our employees, our staff, they deal with. The first is, what do they hear? At times when there's so much other information bombardment going on, the ability to have a large and long attention span is very, very limited. And this is, quite well known. So I think the key to this is simplicity. I think we spoke a little while ago about the communication aspect of it, but the idea is to break down your communication, with your employees, and make it as simple and as easy to understand as possible, if possible, in very clear statements. The second is, in terms of your ability to reach them, they actually want to know, what's happening. They also hear you, in terms of, if their ability to trust you is dependent on how clear that communication is. And therefore, it's important as to who is communicating. Is it the CEO? Is it somebody else? They have to have a trusted messenger whom they believe will be telling them the truth. So the second issue, I think, is to be open. And the key there is to be absolutely transparent. And that communication style is so important. And finally, we have to recognize that, all employees are actually a little bit disturbed at this stage. And hence, there is some resistance that is inevitable. So in such a scenario, I think, there has to be a team of people who are supporting the leaders in terms of anticipating, some of this resistance. And then, listen to people with empathy. Don't cut them off. Just make sure that, they're all, being heard, that the responses are fact-based. They are based on, common ideals and principles that we all fall back upon. So leadership and coaching is all about building trust with the team, making sure that, they also feel that there's someone looking out for them, that nothing very unjust will happen to them. And therefore creating that sense of belonging in difficult times, which makes it, which is actually all the more important in a scenario like this one. Make sure that we all share common goals, because, what might have been communicated before the whole pandemic and, before the situation, you need to share now what is the change scenario, and what are the common goals, which might be immediate, maybe midterm, maybe, in the long term, that, we will now kind of work towards. and generally communicate that the common good is the basis for decision making. It's not that we are going to be biased towards individuals, but we are all going to be focused on what we would call, the common good. But if you go to the next slide, I think the last part of, what we wanted to say is that work from home and, managing from home are very different from actually going into work every day. So therefore, again, this requires a little bit of change in the way we operate and the way we actually communicate and actually bring together work segments that different people are doing. It's so important, where you don't have people to communicate face to face. I think it's very important to have very clear responsibilities outlined, which means that, they have to be established norms for, who is working, how, what are the tasks, when do they finish, whom do they actually get a review from. So the what, who, and when, etc., becomes so much more important in this case. If you don't give the right priorities, then there is no one available on an online basis to get clarifications from, or let's say it will be a little bit more difficult to get clarifications from. So breaking down a task into its constituents and giving clear responsibilities is going to be, extremely important. The second, I think all of us know this very well, collaboration tools. I think lots of us have started using them. Some, more effectively and some less effectively, but everything related to, video and group chats and Zoom and Skype and everything else that works well. However, I don't know if you know, but, we actually tried to do a dry run of with some of the speakers on this particular call, largely to check out if technology has been working well or not. When you bring a set of people together, there are people with different levels of technology literacy, and therefore I think it's always going to be an issue. So I think it's useful to get people trained up in technology, helping them with technology, to the extent that's possible and funding allows. But certainly virtual meeting is very different from, physical meeting, and the norms are so important. Also, certain people may not be able to get a word in, not in a context like this one, but certainly in the smaller context of the organizations that you deal with. And therefore, I think to make sure that you listen, ask people to comment, and make sure that they participate in the discussion is so important. I think for this, there might be some tech training that's useful, some setting of norms, like, entering meetings with the new mute button on and so on, which might sound very basic, but it's so important to get to the right productivity. All in all, I think technology allows you to get closer to your people and make sure that, you demonstrate the care for them. And one of the things that certainly we have done in our organization is that, some of the senior people are having one-on-one conversations and chats with all the employees. So, you break it down into a manageable set of people for every member of senior management, and just ask about, how they're doing, how they're managing. So feel that, make sure that they understand that you care for them, and, you understand their stress areas and try to give them the guidance that they can. So I think in addition to all of the norms that Soumitra described, I think just making sure we also focus on, the leadership aspects, which I just spoke about, the coaching aspect, which is very closely linked in this case with leadership, and working from home are all extremely important. So I think that's really what we had. I think, certainly we know that you're going through stress, but, I think like every organization, I'm sure your funders and your supporters are also looking for impact. And therefore breaks in programs, either operationally or financially, is not something that anyone likes. So I'm sure that, for critical programs, the people will be open to hopefully getting the right funds and the right models in place to be able to provide the services to the community that all of you do so well. So I think it's important to therefore, get your entire ecosystem together, discuss the scenarios ABC that Soumitra spoke about, and make sure at least that you're able to be as effective as possible in the environment. So thank you very much for listening to us. Appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Soumitra and Sudi, for such a wonderful session. We are moving into the Q&A section right now. Some people have already started putting down their questions in the chat box, and we already have a few questions that have come in. So we are going to be reading out the question to you. Soumitra and Sudi, you can actually answer, any of you can choose to answer those questions. And if there are more questions coming, we will stop right at 3:20 till this question and answer round. So please type your questions in the chat box that you see on your screen. The first question is from Dr. Danish Ahmad. He is asking, I am interested to know how NGOs are planning or managing staff expectations about keeping their jobs.
So I think, there is no one single answer, right? I mean, firstly, to my mind, knowing really for your particular organization, how many jobs could you retain, right? And that's where I think just this planning is important, right? I mean, can you pay 1 month salary, 2 months salary, 3 months salary, or next 6 months, you're fine. So I've met a bunch of NGOs where the answer saying that, hey, if you don't get any funding and, and based on your reserves, how long can you kind of continue, right? So I think that answer varies from, unfortunately 1 month in some cases, to a few organizations, very few, who are talking of about 6 to 8 months, right? Uh, so I think firstly figuring that out. Second is to, and therefore, as I said, constantly kind of communicate, right? Saying that, hey, we are in tough times. These are the three things, these are the potential scenarios. These are the 3, 4 things that we are, uh, uh, we are talking, or I mean, we are thinking of, right? So I think that is important, right? I mean, eventually what answer you want to give will vary a lot. I can't, prescribe, and it's not even right to kind of prescribe that answer. But I think, keeping that channel of communication open. And honestly, if you are in a position that you may run out of, the ability to pay, or running out of cash and the ability to pay salaries beyond 2 months, I think that has to, that has to be shared, right? And I don't know too many organizations, but I've heard one where the top management team has said that if this continues, they will take about a 25% cut, and then across the board, the organization is at about 10 to 12% cut people have taken. I don't know if that answers your question. And so, do you want to ask? You want to add anything?
No, I just, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to add that I know that a number of impact funds are actually looking at what we call the bridge financing or crossover financing. So, if you went back to creating the contingency plans that Soumitra spoke about, the A, B, and C plans, and then in each of those scenarios, work out the cash requirements and therefore figure out exactly what you need in terms of bridge financing, then you are actually taking a 3 month or a 6 month period and determining that you need so much more additional cash to manage, hopefully with the principle set out, meaning for example, no retrenchment, we want to manage basic core programs, those kinds of principles being set out. I think then you can actually go to these entities. So, if I know of some of these entities, I'm not sure whether I can name them, but I'm sure some of you know them. Otherwise, message me privately. I'll be more than happy to mention some of these funds that are actually looking to do bridge financing.
Great. Thank you for answering that question. The next question is from Mr. Prabodh, who's asking what type of support is expected to work on livelihood from the government in the coming months in the agri-allied activities, in case if you have any context on that.
So I think certain things that are happening in terms of, direct transfers and all, people are already aware of, right? So don't want to add to that. I think the overall sense, and again, I'm not an expert, so I think firstly the government is at Niti Aayog level, then there is the central government, and then there are, in livelihoods, you have these, state missions and stuff like that. So I'm not fully conversant of everything that's happening. But I think currently there is a sense of really focusing more on the here and now, which is dealing with the medical part of the problem. There are now various scenarios being worked out in terms of if and I won't say when, if not say if, but when the lockdown is kind of lifted, how you will ramp back up, right? But I haven't heard of any great strategy paper out there in terms of, hey, these are the, the 5, 6 concrete steps that we are going to kind of take to work, to improve the work on rural livelihoods. It's unfortunate that it's come at a time, when things are ready for harvesting and all that. The supply chains have got into complete spin, and that's creating a lot of rural distress. But I think, I mean, honestly, sorry, I have not been able to give you more details, but that's what I understand.
Okay. Thank you so much. The next question is from Mr. Sukhendra, who's asking, should nonprofits invest in software and tools which will enable them to go online and be more productive during this pandemic?
I would say resounding yes, right? For two reasons. One, I think the new normal, even for not only, not-for-profits, right? Organizations like us who typically use a lot of technology are, experimenting on now, on the next level, right? At one stage, there were about 490 odd people on this conference, and some people had some, problems with audio and all that, but I guess a bunch of people are able to. Now, we would not have imagined this, even 2 months ago, right? If somebody said, you're going to do this, if Sneha had told me this, or Mary Ellen had told me this, I would have said, hey, you are joking, right? These kind of things don't work, right? But I think, I think this period has shown us that not everything can be done, but there's a bunch of things that could be done. And I know organizations who've been doing it. So, Raj of Lend a Hand, does his regular meetings because they have now employees in, many states, right? So they use Zoom and such other things, quite effectively, right? So I think we can always push the boundaries for two reasons. One, it can help manage cost, right? Technology is improving wherever bandwidth is there. Leveraging some of this is useful. I don't see it fully eliminating the need for meeting in person, but I think wherever such collaboration tools can be used, they should be. I think also what's happening is, at least in the current environment, a lot of tools that are open source and free to use are also there.
Yeah, and you might actually get support from some of the technology organizations if you went to them with good proposals, both in the form of discounted pricing as well as deferred pricing.
Okay. Thank you. That takes us to the next question from Ashwarya from Mahila Saksham Foundation. She's asking, Mr. Sudarshan, this question is for you. You were speaking of acting quickly, but not reflexively. Can you give an example of how crossing the fine line between quickly and reflexively can be avoided, with an example maybe?
Yeah, I'm not sure I used the word reflexively, but nevertheless, I think, I think the more important here, and Soumitra can add, is to be very clearly planned in terms of going forward. I think when I say quickly, you don't want circumstances to overtake you, because I think we are at the beginning of a pandemic. I think, things can go in any direction from here. And there could also be a scenario where, a lot of things could be significantly more impacted than where they are today. So if you create the scenarios that, you are going to be planning for, and be ready when, a particular event occurs, and I think Soumitra was explaining this, then you will be able to take decisions much quicker, rather than responding to everything that happens. You are going to be proactive. So that was what we were trying to communicate.
And I think I gave the example, right, where somebody is expecting a delay in their cash flows, right? And they've already spoken to the funders and they now have some sense that this is how, their funds are going to be delayed. And they've already started actually talking uh, to the landlord for a delay in rent, right? So I think acting without reflection would have been like, hey, let's cut down 2% on all costs, right? But they've identified areas where uh, you know uh, one, how much delay is likely. Now that scenario might change again, like if this pandemic lasts for longer than they've planned. But they've clearly identified, they've spoken to funders, and they are now talking to various suppliers, including, as I said, their landlords, to see if some of the payments could be delayed.
Right. Okay. Going on to the next question from Anupriya, who's asking, I had certain plans to start working full-time from this summer onwards, targeting certain organizations. But because of the economic slowdown, my plan will obviously not manifest in some way, I had imagined. So in this lines, like, how do you think the hiring processes for NGOs will look like right now? What are your views on that?
I think, to be in all honesty, it will be grim, right? Everyone on this call knows, right? Which is not to say that there won't be opportunity. So I don't know Anupriya and what she wants to do, but like, for example, there's a bunch of people who are now doing you know uh, uh, relief work, right? And so there's a bunch of volunteering kind of opportunities there. So it's a very specific question related to the individual in terms of what will whether there will be opportunities for her or not. And uh, so it's difficult for me to honestly answer. But overall, uh, you know will there be a lot more jobs? I think people are looking at their recruitment plans for now, and I don't think people are going out all guns blazing on recruitment. So certainly going to slow down for sure.
Mohit is asking, while the NGOs will need to mitigate for the impact of the COVID-19, how should NGOs mitigate for the challenging regulatory environment, which would include things like requirement on 12A registration, potential changes in the registration of NGOs, not as societies, things like that? How does it affect along those lines as well?
I mean,
I think in general, the CSR expenditure is only going to increase in the long term. Obviously, there is going to be short-term stress, short-term strain, maybe over the next 6, 12, 18 months, whatever. But in the long run, the CSR expenditure is only going to increase. A lot of the new regulations that are being proposed, are still not cast in stone. I think it is something that's evolving. I think government will listen to people, and there will be certain changes that might be made. The only thing is, right now, the clarity on that might take time to evolve because there are other pressing, priorities that are happening. I think, without hesitating, I must say that, this is probably the most significant threat that the economy has faced, and therefore the most significant threat that corporates have faced. So I would say that, the exact rules and the evolution of these rules will take time to come through, but I'm pretty confident that they will actually, they'll come out properly and not to kind of dry up funding or make funding more difficult or starve certain entities of funding.
and I think there are two aspects to it, right? Just to add, so one is the quantum of funding, and two is the some of the rules and regulation around 12A, TG, and stuff like that, right? I mean, honestly, to my mind, they are not necessarily linked to in fact, they're not linked to the crisis at all, right? Because those rules were being kind of framed and thought of, and some of them even implemented before, right? Now, therefore, it's not linked. But my overall, you know, thing about the sector is the sector needs. So we, as participants in the sectors, as NGOs, we are giving voice to the other people. But we ourselves, honestly, don't have a voice, right? So if it is, suppose something is happening for an industry like, let me take just hosiery industry, right? I mean, like, I'm sure, I don't know, but if you look on the internet, I'm sure there's a association for hosiery industry. Forget FICCI and CII level, right? Or there must be one for rubber manufacturers or something like that, right? So I think the challenge with the sector is, there needs to be an organization that represents the sector and represents it strongly. Uh, I mean, some of these policies have come about, and honestly, they're not linked to the COVID-19 crisis. We were dealing with them even earlier, right?
So I am seeing a few more questions that are actually aligned to each other. This is along the line on how are some of these community-based organizations that work on field, for them, mostly the work has stopped. A common question they are asking, how long should they anticipate that this lockdown is going to be continuing, and how much should they prepare for, and if you have any thoughts on that.
These are tough questions, right? I mean, honestly, we are not kind of medical experts. Firstly, there is no precedence to this, right? So you can't look at past data and say this is the only precedence is what's happening in some of the in the other countries, right? So I mean, I really can't say when this will stabilize. Again, I mean, I would want to take us back to this whole framing of what I call circle of concern. And when the pandemic ends, is certainly, a concern for us. But is it something that any one of us as an individual can influence? I think we have very limited influence. Of course, we can by, maintaining social distance and all that. The question to my mind is really, how do you change your operating model? Or how do you, what do you do in this time which is in your influence? So I can share some examples. And it may not, these kind of activities may not last for the next, 2 months. But I know some people who are actually, doing certain pilots in terms of doing things remotely. Some may work, may not work. There are others, a very fairly big organization that I spoke to. They are using the field staff to actually complete their backlog. So they had introduced actually a mobile-based application to gather data, but the staff was still, doing it in pen and paper, right? So they are now kind of using the staff to do some of those backlogs. There are opportunities, such opportunities to kind of, maybe do housekeeping kind of work. When it opens up, I don't know, but whenever it opens up, it also depends where and what you're doing. So for example, if you are an education organization, I think you should assume that you will start work on the field only in the next academic year, right? Because even if the lockdown is lifted, chances are schools will be, closed, right? So if it is a school-based program, I think you don't have access to your community, right? So the answers would honestly vary. I mean, I would say, anyways, you'll hear from the government in the next 9-10 days, but it's expected to be a slow, kind of ramp up. And we've heard some of those things which everyone has heard. So I mean, I can't, I don't have any IP on saying that this will be done in a given manner. Sudarshan, you want to add anything?
No, I only wanted to add that everything is not going to come on stream at the same time, whether it's by vertical, by sector, or by geography, for instance. Certain areas will be more impacted, certain areas will be less impacted. So depending on where you are, which kinds of programs you do, I think you have to be ready, for those scenarios. And the government will give ample warning of some of those things. I think, or even if they don't, your ability to make sure that you consider and then restart your operations to the extent that you can. I think one key thing there, certainly from a field operations perspective, is safety of your employees. I think if you don't compromise on that, I think, and respond to what the government does, I think that's important.
So here's one, I mean, one thought I have, right? And we can figure out how to kind of do this. But honestly, I mean, I always believe in any conference, right? The wisdom is not only with the people who are speaking, right? The wisdom, a lot of wisdom is with the 400 odd people, right? Now, I'm sure at least out of the 400 all, maybe 350 plus have field staff. So I do wonder, maybe Sneha, we can look at it. How can people share the ideas on what they're doing with the field staff, and and be which can be actually useful to everyone, right?
Right.
Sure,
Uh,
so I think we can try and do that after the sessions end for the day.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's a great idea. And just a follow-up question on, not even a question, just like something that you can share some insight on. In terms of like right now, we are thinking it along the lines of still the lockdown, what do we do? But like we've also seen that this whole situation is going to have like a long-lasting impact on the social sector, on the society as well. Like what are your thoughts on how do NGOs prepare themselves for the long lasting effects that it's going to have on the social sector, and what are some things that they need to prepare on? In fact, like we'll take that as a last question and we'll close on that.
Again, I mean, I avoid giving silver bullet kind of answers, right? So the situation, so one thing is very clear, right? I mean, whatever planning you have done, uh, and it's that is important, right? So you've done some planning. uh, Mostly everyone has April 1st as a new year, right? I would say like pre-plan and look at a few scenarios, right? Depending on one, when the pandemic ends. So one, lockdown gets lifted in the next one, next 2 weeks. The other could be hey, it's going to be be a month, and uh, you know hopefully nothing beyond that. And really how long the recovery will take. So I think that's one aspect. The other aspect is what might have happened to your community, right? So for example, if you were working in education with children of construction workers, your constituency itself is not there right now. They've A lot of them have migrated from the cities, right? When they will come back and stuff like that. So I think those kind of uh, I think you need to plan for a few scenarios and see that in each of those scenarios what action you will take. Now, some of these are, and unfortunately, given so many people, we can't give a give an answer that fits everyone, and that's why I think Mary Ellen had mentioned that we are trying to get as many mentors as possible. And if this was a conversation with a given person to say that, hey, this is the program, this is what we're doing, this is what we are seeing happening to our funders, this is what we are seeing, what's happening to our community that we service, I think some more concrete ideas can come. Right now, honestly, as I hear myself, it sounds very, very theoretical, but I am really struggling to give anything concrete in terms of, hey, do these 3-5 things other than a framework.
So, Soumitra, may I give a 3-point formula if I
Sure,
can?
sure.
I mean,
Sure.
not from specifics perspective. I think the first thing is, I think I would start talking to the ecosystem, particularly the people who are funding you, and your well-wishers, your board, because they would have a certain scenario in mind of their own funding. So they have certain priorities. They see a certain vision in terms of how this might be going. So I think getting their inputs is one level of constraint, because then you know what are the degrees of freedom you have from a funding perspective and from an expectation perspective. I think that's so important. I think the second thing that you would have to do is basically understand how your own ability to operate is impacted. So there could be several scenarios, as Soumitra kind of said. For example, there are certain hotspots that may take longer to kind of come back to normal. There are certain that will not come back. So I think that's really important to do. And the third thing is that I think bringing back to one of the points that Soumitra mentioned that I would do is to know that here are the core programs that I would definitely not want to stop. So the sooner I get back to full swing on those programs, those are going to be the drivers of who I am and who I am as an entity. So I think those are the 3 things that I would consider as I kind of create the long-term plans.
Thank you, Soumitra and Sudi, for all those points, and I hope this session was useful. I'm going to hand over the mic to Sneha to take it ahead from here.
Thanks, Manita. And thank you, Som and Suri, for that great session. I just wanted to quickly summarize some of what were the key takeaways for me from this session. And I think one thing that I really took away from the session is that this pandemic is bigger than and much more different than any of the other ones we've seen before. I think these in the past have not taken the shape and the form that this one has. And so that's something that we should keep in mind while we are planning and sort of thinking about what the future might look like, right? The uncertainty is definitely unprecedented. The other thing I took away was the fact that, you know, there will be an impact on programs and there will be an impact on funding in a big way. And so planning for that liquidity crunch is going to be critical from a nonprofit standpoint. There will also be concerns internally on the staff side, and then this overhanging cloud of, you know, uncertainty. And so this is really the context and the constraints within which, you know, as Sudi was saying, organizations need to ask themselves, what is it that they want to be focusing on, right? Som then went on to take us through 8 steps of how one can manage through these tough times. And I think each one of them brought in a very fresh and different perspective, you know, whether it was the board angle or the people angle. And I think what that really points out to is the fact that this problem does not have one solution, right? You have to sort of take a multi-stakeholder approach to addressing all the various concerns that it's bringing to us today. I also really like the point that Sudi then went on to make about leaders being great coaches, right? And this is a time when leadership is about guiding, is about giving hope, and is about being a great coach, and communicating with that empathy with your team as well as your communities and other stakeholders, right? We finished the session with some sort of, you know, good takeaways on how do you work from home. Because in the context of this big picture, really, I think the everyday reality still is that most of us are finding it difficult at different points in time to just deal with working from home, right? And so being able to use technology better, being able to engage more with the team, and making sure that even in this, you know, different scenario, we still try and retain the core of what we do, and are able to sort of stay strong and powerful through these testing times, right? So thank you so much, Som and Sudi, for that great session. We will now be going